Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. I'm so excited to share today's episode with all of you because I recently had the pleasure of sitting down again with Darren. So you'll hear in a moment, I'm going to bring you right back into my interview with him, but this is part 2. In part 2, Darren and I cover more extensively different ways to think about working with someone, a family member, because he was talking about his father who struggled with narcissistic characteristics. How to work with someone, but how to relate to somebody who has these characteristics. I hope you enjoy this episode. Again, this is part 2, and I'm going to bring you right into the point where Darren was asking me a question, which came up at the end of part 1, but we decided to hold off so that we could address it more thoroughly in this next episode. Okay, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Darren. Welcome back, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us today for part 2, what I think is going to be a 2-part series on being with, relating to someone in your life who you think has these narcissistic characteristics. So for those of you who didn't get to listen to part 1, I would encourage you to go back and take a moment if you have it. But just a really quick review. Darren was talking about his own personal experience of being in a relationship with the narcissist, which then led him to realize that he grew up with a narcissistic father who ended up with a medical condition and on hemodialysis, something that was very dear to me because my career in this profession started working with patients on dialysis who I didn't know at the time, much like Darren with his father, who were struggling with personality disorders, and in particular, narcissistic personality disorder, like those kinds of characteristics. So Darren and I were talking about how to engage somebody in this kind of situation, how they are reluctant to feel vulnerable, to accept the treatment, to accept help. And we ended that episode with Darren asking me a question, which I said we would take up in part 2. So Darren, welcome again. And then maybe you could just review the question briefly for those who haven't tuned in to that prior episode. And then we'll keep going from there, if that sounds okay to you.
That's great. Thanks for having me back, Anthony. I'm really happy to keep this going. Yeah, so my question was, this is not an uncommon situation to have a couple sitting in front of me who have come in for therapy. And usually they think it's one person's fault, but it soon comes out, I can tell that they were both focused on the wrong person as being the source of the disordered behavior. In fact, the person who's usually being considered at fault is usually trying to adapt to the person who's more narcissistic. So when I recognize, oh, wow, okay, this person really is dealing with a lot of narcissism, and that is the processes we're working with now. Do you disclose that when you recognize this is what we're working with, or do you just continue working? Because I tend to not disclose it, but in fact, a lot of my materials refer to it. I've been trying to remove narcissism off my worksheets so that I can still use them with people and not have them be offended that that's actually what they're working about.
To your point, what I'm discovering now, just over this past year since I've started my podcast and video channel, is more people come to me because they know that I have quite a bit of experience working with narcissistically disturbed people. So they come in with this sort of knowledge, knowing but not really knowing, they're not sure. But to your point, if they don't know it, and I'm observing something, I don't typically use the sort of jargon with them. I like to get much closer. And I spoke about this a little bit in part 1, is getting really close to somebody's subjective experience. So I much rather understand what's going on. If it's a couple, interpersonally, what's the dynamic that's playing out between them? And I don't get too caught up in the labels of narcissism, but I certainly will describe the traits that make up narcissism. So if there's a certain level of entitlement, if there's projection, if there's that grandiosity that we spoke about, right? If there are all the common or the traits that we see most frequently or appearing, those are the things that I would get into with them. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the way I typically address that.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I mean, we work on the things without labeling it, for sure.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. I'll just say a quick note about that because what I've discovered, and this is very controversial, that oftentimes interpersonally, there is a dynamic that goes on and it's not always so clear that someone is just the raging narcissist, Because when you start getting closer to the nuances of these stories and what leads to the fight, yes, it's always a lot easier to blame somebody and then to recognize if someone gets angry and blows up. And then that's the problem. But typically what I see is what leads up to that is very complicated. And it's not to excuse somebody getting angry and maybe yelling or blowing up or devaluing somebody. But I like to go into the nuances and show them how this is more complicated, that what led to this was you saying to him, I'm crying and I don't want you here. Go away. And then 5 minutes later, you're angry because he left you when you were crying. And what sort of narcissist would leave their crying wife? And then he's like, but you told me to leave. She's like, no, I said, I don't want you here. I never said leave. You see, so how when you get into these nuances, it gets kind of complicated. So that's sort of the position I take, is to get as close as possible to the details of these stories to understand the dynamic that's coming alive.
Right. The main thing is that they need to have intimacy skills and relationship skills that they can build actual real trust. There's a lack of trust, right, in the narcissistic relationships.
Yes, that's right.
There's not quite a letting go to accept that we're in this together. It's like I'm always sort of needing to be strong alone, and I want to do this with you, but strong alone with you. Like, in fact, this is another question. I don't know if you've noticed, but in my own life, I have seen individualistic therapy make this worse. Because a narcissist has gone to therapy and learned how to be happy in their aloneness and still not take accountability for their life. And their relationships are just confusing.
Wait, let's break that down. I'm very curious about that, because I do get a lot of patients who have been in prior treatments that haven't been successful, and then they come to me. But I never heard that one. So maybe can you flesh that out a little bit more, like being happy in their aloneness? Because in my mind, what immediately goes off is it would be very hard to be genuinely happy.
Oh, yeah.
When being alone. So I'm not sure what you mean by like happy in their aloneness.
Well, they've learned skills to manage their mood, basically. It's not that they're happy in their aloneness, really.
I see.
There's an empty hole that they're constantly filling. Instead of filling the hole, they've learned how to always be filling it, essentially. But there's still an empty hole. There's an empty hole where that connection was meant to be. I have seen that empty hole get filled with a religious connection, because they can, fully open up and feel their love and connection and trust with a religious feeling, and they can connect to themselves in that. But the problem with that is they end up having an untraumatized experience only in their religious experience, and then they're still not trusting others outside of that. Me versus you mentality is one of the things we work on. It's that worldview that we need to
that's
divide
splitting.
and conquer.
Yeah, that's what we call splitting.
We're watching the splitting right now. They have their own split. They have the side that's in a good energy and the side that's in their bad energy as well, because they have the things they show and the things they don't show. And they think we're all doing the same thing. They don't realize that, authentic living is actually including your experience in the moment most of the time. There's times when we can't. Sure, you're at work and you can't let out the fact that you're so angry at your daughter. But we need to be able to express what is happening with the relevant people in the relevant situations most of the time, to express what's really happening inside us. And if we don't, that goes very wrong.
Yes.
And it goes very wrong in couples, right? They need to be able to understand each other. You're not going to feel seen and understood if you're not even showing what your true experience is.
Well, that's right. You're not really in a relation, because you're not really in a relationship at that point.
Yeah, we need
you could call it a relationship, but it's a very different type of relationship. Actually, we could call it a narcissistic type of relationship.
We could. Yeah.
Because you're there, but in a genuine way, you're not really present. So there's this whole concept of false self. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's like you're there in a false way because you're not there in a genuine way.
Right. You're not including all of yourself.
Yes.
Just including the parts of yourself that look pretty, or the parts of yourself that you want to show. And you're leaving out the other parts. And when you leave those parts out, it makes them feel like they're unacceptable. That's where shame ends up living. But the reality is we fall in love with each other's flaws. We're all flawed. But in the case of narcissism, they feel like they're not allowed to have flaws. Or if they have flaws, it means they're not as good. So they deny having flaws. We all have flaws. You're watching reality TV and someone exposes that, oh my gosh, I have an issue. I can't seem to leave my shoes alone. I organize them and organize them and organize them, or they share about their anxiety, the audience leans in and feels connection to the person who's sharing their flaws. We all have them. That's why. It's what makes us human. We're not robots and we're not perfect. And that's part of why mental health is so fascinating too, right? We're not robots. There's no two same people. And we're talking about trends in behaviors and trends in symptoms, but no one's identical to each other. It's not like people are built and they have these traits and these symptoms.
Yes.
Narcissism is such a nuanced concept, and it's something we all have, like we said before, different degrees and in different ways. But in the case of narcissism, these are really immature processes. They're not highly evolved, skillful emotional processes.
Yeah, which makes them then so open or amenable to treatment, right? Because they're immature, which means something has not yet been resolved in these people who are struggling with these narcissistic characteristics. And again, I know this isn't a popular way to think about it, but then that's something that becomes part of the work, is helping them develop more mature ways of adapting or coping with painful feelings that are objectionable, rather than what we just said a moment ago, rather than splitting them off. When they get split off, then they get projected onto other people and other people become devalued, right? So all of what you're saying just makes me think the unthinkable, which is that yes, we do and we can help people who struggle with these characteristics.
Right. People's behaviors do not have to be set in stone. You can change your behavior no matter who you are and what. You just have to want to change behavior. And in the case of narcissism, there's such a huge lack of awareness. But if someone is able to wake up enough to be able to have the confidence and the support to be able to take in the new information and develop an awareness of their impact on others.
Yes.
Yeah, there is the potential for change. They have to practice, though. It's like a child learning empathy. Imagine what it would feel like if you were Sally and you were sitting in that Jeep, and then someone came up behind you and yelled, "Boo!" What do you think you would have done if you were Sally? You might have turned around and hit them too, don't you think? You need to talk them into imagining they're in this other scenario, and they need to start learning to do that themselves. We automatically do that. We think, okay, wait, if I knock on Mary's door, wait, she's a nurse, would she be awake right now? We think about those things.
Yes.
They do not. They need to practice. Pause. Think about your impact. Do you want to have a positive impact, or is this all about you?
Darren, I would say to that, again, we're sort of juxtaposing different, approaches. So from a psychodynamic perspective, there's this concept called mentalization, which is developing a capacity to think about one's own, but other mental states. And I've never tried this personally, what you're saying, but what you're saying is like, well, we could teach somebody, right, mentalization. But I would say that's something that grows from within by feeling deeply understood and then developing a capacity to reflect on one's own mental states first. In other words, it's really hard to teach somebody to reflect what somebody else how they would experience you knocking on the door, for instance, until they can reflect on their own. Because, you said it a couple of times, people who have these narcissistic characteristics have a really limited capacity for self-reflection. Remember, you said they keep things very superficial, right at the surface. So in my work with them, typically where we start is through the act of what we call containment, which means it means many different things. And again, I won't go into it in detail, but one of the parts or aspects of containment is helping them develop a more reflective capacity. And when that goes accordingly, then we could help them with this, develop this, what we call mentalization again, other people's thoughts, feelings, and emotions, that they could then begin to take that into consideration. But first, they have to know what's going on inside of them, because if they don't, it simply gets projected. That's another fancy word, but that, what that means, I'm sure. But just for the listeners, that means they give it to somebody else, and then they imagine whatever it is they can't tolerate inside themselves, they imagine it's coming from you. So you can't possibly think about how somebody else is going to experience you when all you could think about is, look at how they treat me so harshly, or look at how they always judge me, or look at how they look down at me. So yeah, it gets a little complicated there, but I think it starts, and at least from my perspective, it starts with the act of containment and helping them develop a better capacity for self-reflection, and then subsequently developing a capacity to think about other people's thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, for me, that's certainly part of the work. I do also focus on what they consider a crisis when they arrive. And often it's the fact that their neighbors hate them and their children don't want to see them and their wife won't ever talk to them again unless they have a lot of therapy. So the first thing we do is stop them abusing others. So that is the number one, is stop abusing others. And the other thing is the others need really clear boundaries that they're not going to accept abuse. So you need really, really clear boundaries with narcissism, right? Because someone who's experiencing narcissism will jump over your boundaries. I mean, they want your boundaries to be where they want your boundaries to be, right? If they want your boundaries to be that they're calling you at 2 a.m., they want your boundaries to be there. So they need to learn to respect others' boundaries. That's sort of part of that, because once they start being nicer to people, essentially, and taking into consideration what their impact might be on them, the warmer people start to get towards them. So it starts to create a bit of a loop.
But wait, let me jump in, because then I would, again, just different ways of thinking about this for the audience, okay? But the question becomes, where does the loop start? Like, where do we make our inroad into the loop? And with Darren, what you're suggesting is one possible way to make an inroad, which is they need to treat people in a better way, right? But another way to make an inroad is to understand why it is they treat somebody in the way that they're treating them. In other words, how are they experiencing this person? So that's the self-reflection part. So in other words, I did a whole episode on this earlier on. It was called like the projective, introjective, malignant cycle. So what gets projected gets introjected. So if they're projecting anger, they imagine that you're always angry at them.
Right.
Right. So then, of course, they're going to treat you in a harsh way, because look at the way you treat me.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just interesting for you and I to flush this out for the audience, is to think about, where do you get the most bang for your buck? And it doesn't have to be one or the other. Let's not split. Let's not enter the world of like fragmentation. It could be both. In other words, you could try what Darren is suggesting, is you start to break the loop in one way, but if you're not making inroads, you may have to break it the other way, which is to get closer to their subjective experience and understand how it is, or what led to them being so angry and blowing up.
One thing that emerged for me when you were speaking there was their worldview matters a lot. That does guide a lot of behavior. If I think you're judging me, I'm going to judge you. You're judging me back. If I think you're going to, if you're trying to steal from me, I'm more likely to steal from you. If I think you're trying to cheat in this game, I'm more likely to cheat in this game. So your worldview of how you experience others matters a lot. And how they deal with this worldview, or how I've noticed some deal with this worldview, is that is how they are with most people. But then for certain people, they will idealize them and put them above what they consider to be the way people are.
Until
they fall off it, and then they're worse.
And this is, again, something you hear so frequently in social media. It's like, then the narcissist flips, and they'll go from idealization to devaluation. And my own experience is someone does not just flip. Something precedes that, but you have to get really close to these people to, again, look at the nuances. And more often than not, what I discover is they feel slighted. They feel abandoned. They feel rejected. And then they go, the partner goes from this idealized to this devalued state. I've sort of flushed this out with clinical material in the past to demonstrate the sequence, but they don't just wake up one morning and say, okay, now you're going to be devalued. But something typically happens in between that often goes unnoticed, because it could be so subtle, but so serious to them, because it cuts so deeply, because they have such a fragile sense of self.
Yeah. And that's what happened in my relationship that was so confusing to me.
Yeah.
Because my partner was so sensitive to perceived criticism that if they came home and I wasn't looking at them with admiration and excitement that they're home, for example, that was enough. Like, what's wrong?
Yes.
What's going on over there? Why are you so grumpy? Why are you looking at me like what? What are you talking about? And
wait, Darren, let's play this one out just for the audience. So I'm doing this like live example. So if that someone was in my office, let's say, and they had that reaction, like, what's going on? Why are you so grumpy? See, now we know already that they are becoming dysregulated, right? Something is getting them quite anxious, but we don't know exactly what it is, because you said, I don't feel grumpy. I feel okay. So if you feel okay, and this is, I'm just giving you a little sample of the way I would handle this clinically. What I would say is, then why not become curious? right? Rather than saying, no, nothing is wrong, I'm fine. Why not become curious and say, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? Like, check in with your spouse. What did you notice? And even be open. This part's really hard, and you don't really hear this too much, but be open to the fact that it is possible that maybe you are a little grumpy and you yourself don't even realize it. You know, just like we make mistakes sometimes with patients and they catch us because they're so sensitive. You know, they're so attuned to us. And I do this sometimes. If I make a mistake, I have to say, you know what? Actually, I don't think I did pay close enough attention to when you said your boyfriend left, you know, to go on vacation. I should have paid closer attention to that. So just accepting their reality as a first step usually cools them down, because then they feel validated. And then that argument that you, and I'm sorry, I jumped in the middle of you showing me how it escalates quickly, but usually that's enough to diffuse it so that then the two of you can begin to talk about, hey, so what's going on here? What's getting you so upset right now? But tell me, what do you think about that? Because you're in it, by the way. I mean, you were in it, so you know better. Mm-hmm.
I feel it from an energetic, for one. But also, the mirrors that you're giving to this person matter a lot, because it's like their nervous system is too open. If you look at them with a positive light, that validation feels so good. But if you look at them in a bad light, that feels so bad.
Yes.
In fact, they are extremely sensitive, and they're denying that they're sensitive, but they are dependent on you to feel good, in fact. So if you're their partner and they get triggered into not feeling good, yeah, certainly it's your fault. They believe it's your fault. And that's where abusive behavior often comes in, right? Like, you made me feel like this. Like, all I did was look at you with disappointment, right? And I should be allowed to feel disappointment, but I'm not allowed to feel disappointment because it causes them to feel so much. It makes them feel like they're disappointing. Like, it's the difference between guilt and shame, right? It's like they take it in as if it's not that I'm disappointed in what you did. It's like, I'm disappointed in you. Like, they take it as like, bah.
Okay.
And then they're attacked.
Okay, wait. Let's stay with that descriptively. This is beautiful. Like, such a nice illustration.
Response.
Because then the question becomes, for anybody who's listening, if you're in this kind of relationship, or for Darren and I, maybe who are working with somebody like this, earlier we mentioned, like, what's the inroad? So how do you make an inroad into something like this? So you described it very nicely, that you're not allowed, you said, right, to do what? Well, what's it, Darren? You're not allowed to, I forgot the word you used, be disappointed or look at them in a certain way? Well,
yeah, you're not allowed to have a negative emotion towards them. That makes them feel bad. If I was having a negative emotion towards my partner, I was then being called, you're so abusive, you're so abusive. And that was one of the things I was like, what are you talking about? Because I knew I wasn't. But that's what you're talking about. Like, they really perceived me as being abusive because they were feeling abused, because that's how it felt. But they were abused in the past. They were abused when their parent kicked them out of the house at 16 and they felt complete rejection. They're not being abused now because I'm feeling disappointed that they came home 40 minutes late and forgot to stop for the thing.
What do you do? What do you do with something like this? How do you handle it?
They recognize the feeling is inside of them. I mean, as a client, they're eventually learning that their feelings are inside of them, and they're not coming from the person over there.
Okay.
So they eventually learn, like, they don't deserve your contempt, in fact.
Yeah. So then you're helping them separate out what belongs to them and what belongs to the other person.
Right.
Yeah, I understand.
So that helps them to stop being abusive, for one. But it also helps them because they start naming what they're feeling. Like, I'm feeling really angry right now, because they have to learn to, and if they can't go there, they have to go, like, my heart rate's starting to go up and I feel really tense. Like, they might have to say it that way if they need to say it that way. But to be able to include what's happening in the moment. And like, yeah, you feel really angry and you feel tense. Can we breathe through it? Or, what does that anger want to say right now? And anger is an emotion that moves us forward, but it's usually pushing their partners away, of course.
I appreciate that approach. I would typically at this point, I would jump in and say a more psychodynamic perspective, but I'm in agreement with you, because that's the first order of business, is separating out what belongs to you, because self-other differentiation is so limited in these relationships. That's the idealization, and all of that's like a merged relationship. So if you could begin to increase self-other differentiation, what belongs to you and what belongs to your partner, yes, that should help, as you're describing, immediately get someone into a more calm or regulated state of mind. But then the next step, just to add this before we wrap up, and I'd love to grab your opinion on it, the next step would be, because this will continue, even though you do this, for someone who really has a personality disorder, this is going to repeat itself because they're so fixed in the way that they think. So the next step would be, I've noticed oftentimes that you experience me in this way. Do you notice that as well? You see, now gradually what I would want to do is help them get into what we call self and other representations. In other words, the way they see you based on a distorted image, right? Sometimes that's getting projected of themselves, but it's not all of Darren. In other words, it's like a caricature of Darren. The worst parts of Darren is what they see. And then all the good things about Darren will completely disappear. So that would be, I'm just looking ahead in terms of what the next step would be in terms of the progression of developing, helping them develop a more integrated sense of themselves and of Darren, because that's what leads to a loving relationship, is you need integration. But anyway, listen, I'm going to give you the last word, Darren. I know that was a mouthful, but I'm curious if you have any reaction to that or anything you like to say before we pull things together.
Yeah, no, I was on the same page. Object constancy was what I called it. They learned that when you're angry at your partner, that becomes everything that's true for you in that moment. For most people, when we get angry, we are able to hold that this is the person who we love, who is on our side and who cares about me. And because I'm able to remember that, I know that they do not deserve my contempt and blame, because it's like hurting myself. This person is on my team. When you get into anger, you literally don't remember that, and you forget. And you think they deserve your abuse or your withdrawal or your contempt or your vindication, but they get that and they understand that that's something that's not happening for them. They want to learn how to hold those things together, and they can. But with that awareness, they're able to start to get that, because when they understand they're having immature emotional processes, they want to have mature emotional processes. And once we start understanding, that's where we have to work on motivation quite often. They need to know what's in it for them all along the way.
Yes. And we have to work, and I love that you introduced this concept, because now you're speaking sort of the psychoanalytic language, which is object constancy. So we have to help build object constancy, which is a whole nother discussion, because that's a developmental achievement that most people, well, everybody with personality disorders, never achieve that level of development. But that's a story for another day. And I hope there is another day, Darren, because it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And I really appreciate that you took the time and you enlightened us with a very unique, well, both personal and professional way to think about narcissism. So thank you again for that.
Thank you, Anthony. I think to take it to that, we're out there working with it. People don't seem to realize that's happening, but it is. We're out there working with it. If someone's aware and wants to do personal work, there is personal work to be done. It is not true that there's nothing we can do with narcissism.
Yes, that's a wonderful way. I like leaving it on that note. So thank you again.
Thanks.
And to all the listeners, thank you for tuning in. And I shall see you next week. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.